Allison, there's no sound. I think you may have to unmute your mic.
Equitable systems. Welcome. My name is Malik Henfield, and I am the founding dean of the Institute for Racial Justice. We are Loyola University Chicago's interdisciplinary hub for racial justice and equity work in Chicago and beyond. We at IRJ consider ourselves a think and do space for converting abstract findings and ideas into long-term action plans. We aim to reimagine our campus as the go-to destination for community-informed scholars and data-informed leaders. We assert that forming teams comprised of skilled scholars and forward-thinking leaders will, over time, produce equitable systems that work for all. We collaborate with our partners to step outside the ivory tower and translate complex concepts in ways that are more accessible to the masses. One of the areas we'll be drilling down on is racial capitalism. Through a series of webinars and in-person conversations, we will explore racial capitalism and ponder its use as a powerful lens to view liberation and freedom from a racial justice and equity standpoint. I, for one, am excited about this series and thankful to our partners in the School of Law for helping to make it happen. We appreciate your interest in our work and ask that you please go to luc.edu/IRJ to learn more about what we're doing and how you can get involved. Thank you.
Good morning, all. I hope that you are enjoying this wonderful rainy weather. My name is Tavis Jules, and I'd like to thank Dr. Henfield for his glorious welcome this morning. As I said, I'm Tavis Jules. I am a professor in the School of Education in the Department of Higher Education, and I would like to welcome you to our series, the first in our series on racial capitalism. And today we'll be talking about racial capitalism and health disparities. And so we have a very exciting and invigorating guest with us this morning, Dr. Fatimah Jackson-Best, and we'll be having this conversation this morning. And so again, I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for spending your rainy morning with us. And we look forward to having a provocative and interesting discussion. This is our first interdisciplinary conversation on racial capitalism, a very loaded term that we will seek to unpack over the course of the next 90 minutes or so. And we're happy that Dr. Jackson-Best is able to join us. Dr. Fatimah Jackson-Best is a public health researcher with a specialization in mental health and focuses on communities in Canada and the Caribbean. She holds a PhD from the University of Toronto in public health and has conducted her dissertation research on Black women's experiences of maternal depression in Barbados. Dr. Jackson-Best is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Health Research Methods, Evidence, and Impact at McMaster University. She's also a project manager at the Black Health Alliance for Pathways to Care project, which seeks to improve access to mental health and addiction services for Black children, youth, and their families in Ontario. Our conversation today will be a Davos-style conversation where I will ask a few questions, then I will pause and I will take questions from the audience, and then I'll ask some more questions and pause again and take some more questions from the audience. So we're going to have a very interactive discussion and conversation this morning. So just not the two of us alone up here, but hopefully we involve the audience. And we ask that you place your questions in the Q&A box, and I will take those questions once I see them in the Q&A box. So I'll stop at any point in time and take those questions from the Q&A box. And I also encourage you to use the chat function and put your thoughts in the chat as well too, as you hear the conversation go on over the course of the next 90 minutes or so. And so Dr. Jackson-Best, a very close friend of mine, a longtime colleague, welcome to our first webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. Should I call you Tavis or Dr. Jules?
Tavis works for me, just
Perfect.
Wonderful.
Okay, and Fatimah works for me as well, or Fatimah.
Perfect. Wonderful, Fatimah.
Perfect.
Thanks. So Fatimah, in a recent publication that just came out, one of the things that argues is that the new racial capitalism literature looks or traces the historical role of white supremacy in the processes of dispossession, extraction, accumulation, and exploitation, which are central to capitalism today. Can you tell us, first and foremost, how you define racial capitalism in your work, and what does racial capitalism mean to you?
Sure. So thank you so much for the good starting question, Tavis. I always like to start any conversation with a common definition, not taking for granted that we all come here with the same amount of knowledge on a particular topic or even interest on a particular topic. This might be people's bread and butter. And for some, it might be the first time they're hearing about racial capitalism. So defining things is always very important. And in the definition of things, we can also give credit to where these terms come from. So the same way that I like to credit intersectionality to Kimberly Crenshaw is the same way that I would like to credit racial capitalism, the term, to Cedric Johnson, who was a Black male, a Black man. He was a professor emeritus of political science and Black studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And he describes racial capitalism as a modern world system that is dependent on slavery, violence, imperialism, and genocide. He goes on to explain that capitalism was racial not because of some sort of conspiracy to divide workers or those whose labor is being exploited or to justify slavery and dispossession. But he really points to the ways that racism had already been permeated in Western societies. So according to Johnson, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial direction. So what Johnson is really making us turn our eyes to is the coexistence of these phenomenons, racism and capitalism, and that they build upon one another. They exist through the other one being present and being permeating our societies. So that's the formation, the foundation of racial capitalism that I like to work from. But I also like the American Medical Association's definition, which is very short and catchy. It describes racial capitalism as the racialized exploitation and capital accumulation, which are mutually reinforcing. So it's the same kind of idea. They exist at the exact same time. And what I like about the emphasis on them mutually existing and building upon one another and coexisting is that it disallows some of those conversations that people get into. Well, what came first? Was it capitalism or was it racism? Which one allowed the other? And I think that those conversations can be derailing and sometimes even a bit simplistic, right? Racial capitalism is telling us, it's not about which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's really saying that these are both phenomena that are occurring at the same time and that they strengthen and extend one another through their existence.
So thanks for that. I think, oftentimes when we think of racial capitalism, we're also sort of focusing on this exploitation of labor that you're talking about. And so your work on health disparities, can you tell us how you sort of position or juxtapose health disparities and its connection to labor exploitation? Because I think we all think of work as work, but we never really think of work as exploitative. Can you sort of shed light on what does that mean?
Yes. So, my work is really focused fundamentally on exploring health inequities in Black populations and communities. I've done work in the Caribbean. I've been doing work for the last 4 years here in Ontario on mental health. And where I start from always is recognizing that racism and capitalism obviously coincide and construct harmful social conditions that will fundamentally shape and impact our health. That includes health disparities, disease, illness, and of course, mental health and illness. And I think that when we think about capitalism, we oftentimes don't think about the impact that it actually has on our mental health and illness. But if we are already constructed as being laborers and potential sites of exploitation, that is demeaning, that's diminishing of ourselves, right? And it is already demeaning and diminishing of ourselves, and that will absolutely have an impact on our mental health and wellness, and also on our physical health and wellness. So anyway, the work that I do is obviously very much concerned with health inequities in Black communities and Black populations here in the Caribbean, but it's also concerned with what contributes to those inequities, both contemporarily and historically. So I don't look at mental health in a vacuum. I'm not looking at mental health as it exists now. I necessarily, as a Black person doing work within Black communities, both here and abroad, I have to look at the historical factors that have impacted or could impact people's health and disease and ill health and disease. So therefore, the effects of phenomena like slavery and colonialism and the impacts that that has had on Black people, which we know that both of those phenomena were driven by hyper-capitalism, hyper focus on exploitation and enslavement, of course, those have to be considered and linked to ongoing contemporary systems of oppression, such as policing, lack of access to good healthcare systems that are culturally responsive, and of course, systemic anti-Black racism. So, you know, in my work, I don't always need to explicitly say that this is about racial capitalism, but the way that my work connects back to, you know, coloniality and enslavement and the lack of healing that Black communities have been able to engage in and the impact that that has on us now, I have to talk about the historical component. And that's a huge part of racial capitalism because we're not looking at things in a static kind of vacuum, right? We recognize that there's a continuum of exploitation and a continuum of oppression that we're consistently been made to live in and to be exploited through.
I'm still stuck on this idea that you just talked about the way in which capitalism impacts my mental health. And so could you expound upon that? Because I don't really think, when I think of capitalism and mental health, I think of them as divided, separate things, but you're now sort of telling me that one impacts the other and influences the other. Expound a little bit more on that for me, please.
Yeah, well, Tavis, let's just look at it, right? Because I know that I don't live in the US, but in Canada, we are, you know, prided and lauded for our universal healthcare system, but we don't talk about what is not covered. So while I can go to the doctor to get, you know, a physical checkup and it won't come out of my pocket, or you know, if I'm feeling ill, I can go to the doctor and get a prescription and see a doctor. It might take 33 hours, which is actually the wait time in our ER rooms right now, but I'll probably get some help at some point. But what our healthcare doesn't cover are dental care and mental health care. And I know that the same is true for many people all around the world. It's the same in Barbados. The healthcare system there, by and large, covers physical health, but doesn't care for your mental health and the kind of ongoing mental health and wellness that we have to engage in. So seeing a therapist, a social worker, a psychotherapist on an ongoing basis. If you're presenting with extreme mental health challenges or issues, you might be able to get, you know, some help through a mental health hospital, but to get a psychiatrist is a whole different, or a psychologist is a whole different perspective. So that is a symptom or outcome of capitalism. If you do not have the capital to invest in your mental health, what are you going to do? You have to just live with it. You have to make do with whatever is going on in your life. You have to figure out other ways to cope with it. And that can lead to exacerbated mental health issues or mental illnesses if we're not getting the ongoing care that we need and that we deserve. So, you know, just the idea of having to pay out of pocket for things that are part of our overall health, our overall sense of wellness, that is directly linked to capital because we have to pay to play. We have to have the capital to be able to engage in certain healthcare systems, whether it's here in the US or in the Caribbean. So that's one way that mental health and capitalism, one, I think, palpable way that we can make a link between mental health and capitalism. But as I said, on the other side of it, if we are living in capitalist societies, which we obviously are, and we're also living in very, you know, systemically racist societies where certain people's labor is more valued than other people's, we're not seeing people being paid the way that they should be paid for important jobs, like, you know, people who do maintenance work and people who are teachers, et cetera. These individuals, of course, over time are going to feel burnt out, broken down, because they're not being valued at the level that they're supposed to be valued, and that can have a negative impact on our mental health and our wellness.
So I'm going to take a question from the audience from the chat now, rather than continue with my questions. But I think this is a good question that segues into what we were talking about. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to place them into the Q&A box as well too. So the question that we have right now in the Q&A box states, if, as you argued, racial capitalism shows that race and capitalism are interconnected, does this mean that anti-racist struggles and anti-racist capitalist struggles are interconnected? Can you expound a little bit on that, please?
That's a really good question. So, no. Short answer, absolutely not. We know that many anti-racist struggles that are ongoing are sadly also sites of white supremacy and white privilege, right? Just because people are saying that they're anti-capitalist or saying that they're anti-racist, it doesn't mean that they're focused on anti-Black racism. It doesn't mean that they are focused on the specific ways that capitalism negatively impacts Black communities. So it's not a linear kind of cause and effect that can be drawn there. But it should be, anti-capitalist struggles should be inherently anti-racist and also have an explicit focus on anti-Black racism, because that's another level of racism, right? And a more permeating level of racism that we've seen in these kinds of struggles. But famously, many anti-capitalist struggles and movements have been critiqued for being, very focused on one segment of the population who don't necessarily even experience capitalism or racism in the way that other more marginalized groups may, right? So, remember the Occupy Wall Street protests. That was back when I was, I think, in undergrad. A lot of that, the sentiment, of course, was important. That big banks and big businesses are being bailed out, but the average person is struggling. But that movement was consistently critiqued for being a very white space. And a lot of these capitalist struggles, especially in cities like Toronto and large cities like Chicago and New York, et cetera, they are consistently critiqued for people experiencing anti-Black racism. It's very common. So unfortunately, it should be the case, but unfortunately, it's not.
So in light of what you've just said, why should we care about capitalism today? And if nothing else, are there any lessons from the global pandemic that we should take away when thinking about racial capitalism today?
Well, capitalism affects all of us, whether it's directly or indirectly, whether your labor is being exploited for profit or whether you benefit from the exploitation of someone else's labor. And so if we're thinking about racial capitalism, which would be obviously the overlap or the overlay of people who have been made most marginalized in our communities, that labor is going to be hyper exploited, and people who benefited are going to be hyper benefited, right? So if we understand capitalism as this all-encompassing kind of structure, and that within that there are kind of levels to it, and people who disproportionately undergo the impacts of racial capitalism, then we should all care about racial capitalism and capitalism. We should all be anti-capitalist and be working towards true racial equality. And so, I like the second part of your question, asking about the recent global pandemic and what we can learn about racial capitalism through the pandemic and vice versa. I read this really wonderful article by Wendy Purtle, who talks about racial capitalism as being a fundamental cause of disease in the world and will be a root cause of the racial and socioeconomic inequities in COVID-19 that we will be left to sort out when the dust settles. She wrote that in 2020. And it's so poignant because in 2022, going into 23, I absolutely see her prediction coming to fruition. So I'll give you an example of my context. So I live in Toronto, Ontario, which is the sister city to Chicago. And when the pandemic started, well, first of all, in Canada, we have a problem with race-based data. That's one place where the United States really beats us. The collection of race-based data is a blind spot that we have consistently not engaged in, and that people who do race-based research and race-based statistics have been pushing for our governments, whether they are our federal governments or our provincial governments, have been really pushing for the collection of data when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, to make sure that we're ensuring that we're collecting information about race, right? Because race matters when it comes to education. Race matters when it comes to healthcare and access to healthcare. So anyway, in Ontario, when the pandemic started, there were several different cities that said, we need to be, well, people who were proponents were saying, we need to be collecting race-based data during this pandemic because we need to know who is contracting COVID-19, who might be dying from COVID-19, and other kinds of factors that we can start measuring to see what kind of disproportionate impacts the pandemic is having on communities, right? And so, there are many different cities across this province, but really two were the ones who were collecting race-based data throughout the pandemic, and that's Toronto. And to the west of us, we have another city that we call Peel, the Peel region. And so through that data collection, we started to see, or we were able to see, that more Black and Southeast Asian people were not only contracting, but also dying from COVID-19. And when you got that information, it was now time for us to peel back the layer further. Why are these communities dying more from COVID-19? Is it a genetic thing? Is it a survival of the fittest thing? These are some of the things that you're hearing, in common talk in the news, et cetera. But when you really looked at it, what were these people doing on a day-to-day basis? Most people who were contracting and dying from COVID-19 who were Black and Southeast Asian were people who were essential workers. They were personal support workers in senior citizen homes. They were essential workers working in, transportation, who were working in education, who were working in food services, right? Those are people, you can't work from a factory at home. You have to physically go to work. How are they getting to work? They were taking public transportation, which, were also incubators for COVID-19, for lack of a better term. And, even in their job sites in these factories, they weren't giving proper PPE. They were considered disposable because of their race, but they were also considered essential because of their labor. And we saw that, not even 2 years ago, and it's ongoing. It's still the same communities and the same groups of people who are contracting and dying from COVID-19 at disproportionate rates. So, racial capitalism is important to care about because it's really about shining a light on these unjust systems that persist and negatively impact communities that have been made marginal, such as Black communities in Ontario and Toronto and Peel and Southeast Asian communities who were, disproportionately contracting and dying from COVID-19.
No, that's sort of wonderful that you sort of shed light on the link between the two, because I think oftentimes we've disconnected it, and we don't really think of the way in which the pandemic has shone a light on some of the excesses that has come to be born because of neoliberalism. I have 3 questions in the chat here from the audience, so I'm going to sort of pause and read these to you. And ask for your thoughts and input on them. I'll just go individually and you can just respond quickly to them. The first one is being asked, what does progress look like in terms of racial inequities and capitalism?
So to me, progress looks like total transformation of our systems and complete overhaul of the existing systems. To me, I just said this, I was at a conference in Barbados last week, and I said this, we had a whole session about capitalism and feminism and are they mutually exclusive? And I was like, yeah, like there's no way that we can work towards women's rights while knowing that women's labor is fundamentally exploited, whether women are, engaged or not engaged in, but are being affected by the gender wage gap, or whether women who are homemakers are never being paid for their labor, right? We can't have feminism and capitalism, and thus far it has not worked. We have to work in this system, we have to function in this system, but that doesn't mean that the system is not inherently dysfunctional. So I think that progress looks like total transformation of our system. So that includes overturning and creating new systems of systems that we can work in outside of capitalism or even socialism. I wouldn't call myself either. But it also looks like, real systemic transformation to our system so that racism, discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, all of those phobias and isms are also overturned. So, I think that progress can only look like a complete transformation. And I know that's a little bit scary. And sometimes when I say it, I get scared, right? Because I think, this is all I know. What could be different and what could we lose? But I also think, what could we gain if we're thinking about total transformation of our systems? So that's my answer.
So sort of building off of this point, I think the second audience question is really relevant because they're asking, how can we dismantle the exploitation of capitalism broadly while ensuring that these efforts are anti-racist and properly accounting for racial capitalism?
Now, this is a big question, and I'm reading them along with you, Tavis. I had a bit of a sneak peek before you read it out loud. This is a tough one. You know what? I don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but I do think that we need to decenter the things and people that have traditionally been at the center of these movements, right? So if we want to be anti-racist and we want to ensure that our, work towards dismantling racial capitalism or accounting for racial capitalism is inherently anti-racist, okay, well, who's at the center of that work, right? So that's why I started off with Cedric Johnson's discussion and definition of racial capitalism, because he's the one who coined the term. We see people extending the term and extending the analysis of it, but not giving credence to the person who is, right? And that's decentering his work, that's decentering his contribution. We have to consider, no, not consider, we have to work towards centering the people who are the most affected by these processes, right? So that has to be queer people, that has to be women, that has to be trans people, that has to be Black people, that has to be Muslim people, Muslim Black people. We need to completely rethink how we are addressing these systems, but also reproducing the same kinds of power dynamics, right? We can't keep on doing the same thing and expecting that we're going to get different results. We need to recenter the fundamental ethos of these concepts, and that's really centering those who have somehow become marginal when we are the most impacted by these things, right? So we need to ensure that we're taking up that space and we're given that space, and that people are stepping back, even if you have a million degrees and all the expertise, right? How are we mentoring and working with people to ensure that they are at the forefronts of these movements? So that's, again, I don't have all the answers, but I would absolutely say, we have to decenter white supremacy, whiteness, and reproducing the same kinds of systems that have been, shown to be broken.
No, that is awesome. And I like what you're sort of saying about decentering the self. And I encourage the audience members to keep the questions coming, because right now we're in audience questions still, and I think they're really good. And this other audience members question is really interesting, because it talks about not only your idea of decentering that you talked about just now, but also stepping back. And so somebody's actually stepping back and being reflective. And I really like this question that they're posing. And they're asking, how do we maintain hope or the ability to continue living under these oppressive systems? I find myself walking through my work day with such malaise, and I want to live differently, but I feel so burdened by having to work.
Well, you're not alone, because we're all working. And I feel like there's a collective, I felt it a lot during the pandemic, this collective burnout, right? Like, we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're scheduling back-to-back Zoom meetings, back-to-back Skype meetings, back-to-back Microsoft Team meetings. Every single platform that exists to have a meeting, I absolutely have it, and I've used it throughout the pandemic. And I felt this collective sense of burnout. And I have a team of researchers at the Black Health Alliance and health promoters, and we would talk about this, right? And we started doing these team check-ins to see how are people feeling. And I was hearing, I'm feeling burnt out, I'm feeling overextended, I'm feeling scared. I'm living in a pandemic. I have no idea what's going to happen next. I haven't seen my family in 6 months. I haven't seen my grandparents in a year, right? And I felt like it was at that moment that I needed to recognize that we're all, experiencing this collective sadness, this collective grief, this collective difficulty, right? And so that makes me really, I'm relating that to this question about, maintaining hope, right? I think it's okay to feel sad about the world that we live in. Like there's a huge problem. It's okay to feel, to be realistic and realize like this system is absolutely broken, and it's not only broken, it's breaking down in front of our very eyes, right? And we're seeing the impact on the climate and on communities and on individuals, right? But the way that I also, because my work is in mental health, I could not do this work without having venues and avenues to explore hopefulness and to explore joy. And so one of the ways that I maintain hopefulness and maintain joy is by tapping into what other people are doing and where people are having successes, right? People that are groups of people and individuals and communities who are, doing their best to challenge capitalist systems, people who are doing organizing work. I get a lot of joy and hope from, movements in the Caribbean around gender justice and LGBTQ rights. I get a lot of inspiration as well from struggles that I see Muslim women, participating in. That's where I get my hope from. So I would say tap into places where people are doing that work, and not only tap into them to observe and feel good, but what can I learn from this? How can I infuse this into my work, into my life? How can I, if I'm doing research, how can I make it more community-based and participatory? And how do I infuse hope as a part of my praxis, whether that's my research praxis or my teaching pedagogy? There's different ways that we can maintain and hold on to that hope and also build it, right? But at the same time, it's okay for us to feel the feelings that we have. It's okay to recognize that you feel that malaise and that you feel, it's difficult to walk through life in this current context, but we can't stop at that point, right? We have to push forward. And the way that we push forward is through action. So we can't stand still.
You mentioned a bit there in answering this last question, a little bit about your religion and faith. We're obviously at the Jesuit University, and religion and faith are important to us. My question to you is, as a cisgender Muslim woman, how does your religion influence the way you think about racial capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Well, my religion, so I do identify as a Muslim. I'm a Black Muslim woman. I was born a Muslim. Obviously, I was also born Black. And so the way that my community has looked at the existing system has really influenced the way that I navigate through the world. So I've always been taught and see my religion through a justice-oriented framework. So, there's so many passages from our, religious texts and traditions that talk about justice, right? And when we think about what is inherently unjust, capitalism is inherently unjust, racism is inherently unjust, sexism is inherently unjust, all of these other systems of oppression are inherently unjust. So if I approach my world or the way that I move through the world with that same lens that I have through my religio-cultural foundation, I have to be engaged with justice. And so all of my work, whether it's about mental health, whether it's about Black Muslims in Canada, whether it's about health disparities, in Ontario, or, health education and promotion, it's about restoring or working towards justice. And that's why I work primarily with Black communities, because we know that, the foundation of North America has been built upon the displacement and dispossession of first Indigenous people and enslavement of African people. We know this, right? So as a person who is Black and who comes from this tradition, this religious and religio-cultural tradition, I have to be focused on justice. All of my work has to be towards, restoring or contributing towards justice, and that's what brings me hope. To be completely honest, just bring it back to the question that was in the Q&A box. Focusing on justice and celebrating justice. When I see it happening, or when I'm able to witness the progress towards justice, that gives me hope, and it makes me, it gives me that spiritual I guess, fulfillment as well. But yeah, I obviously my work is not like it's not really. I didn't even know that this is a Jesuit seminary. Actually, that's new information for me. I had no clue. But from that perspective, like the school is also very has to be focused on justice. So I'm expecting that that's why this webinar series is happening, because of the tradition of justice and working towards equality. So that's a framework that I like to operate from. And I don't think, not everybody, I recognize not everybody has a religion or engages with a religion or is spiritual. And I respect that 110%. But for me, from my perspective, it's what really drives me and what gives me it gives me purpose, it gives me hope, and it gives me some level of fulfillment.
We have a couple other questions in the chat box that I'm going to go back to. One of them is asking, how does the racial disparities in the COVID-19 affects ties into universal healthcare? And linked to that is another question on healthcare where Wendy says that I'm a healthcare provider in Toronto, and time again, we are affected with the challenges of having to sustain and propose transformation/transition from racial health disparities to health equity. Beyond putting a racial equity lens on policy and education practice, how do we effectively engage members without developing anti-Black, anti-Indigenous fatigue? That's a really interesting question. How do we do this work without sort of having that sort of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous fatigue?
Okay, so I'm going to address Wendy's question first, the healthcare provider piece. This is tough because when COVID-19 started and the George Floyd murder occurred and we saw the BLM resurgence in that summer of 2020, I was shocked by how much I was seeing people turn towards discussions of systemic anti-Black racism, systemic racism, anti-Indigenous, discrimination and racism. I could not believe that I was hearing people to use the words systemic anti-Black racism and institutional and systemic racism. Like it was shocking to me, and it was a happy shock, but I was also cautiously shocked because I said, we're seeing this huge tide turning towards people acknowledging anti-Black racism and everybody putting up a black square and people putting BLM in their social media profiles, but there's always the tide always turns, right? It's like waves in the ocean. You get one wave and then another wave comes and crashes and it might be even bigger. And so I was shocked, but I was cautious. And the amount of people that were reaching out to us in the organization at Black Health Alliance with donations of amounts that the organization had never seen, large corporations. Like I won't even tell the story, but actually I will. A large corporation contacted me and said, we came to one of your sessions and we want to donate to the organization. Can we have a call? And when I heard the amount that they were going to donate, I was absolutely shocked. This is from a large corporation in Canada. So yeah, I was worried. I thought, everything's going to dry up. It has to dry up at some point. People's attention and intentions are going to shift. And like clockwork, that absolutely happened, right? We still see anti-Black racism. We still see, our communities being under siege. We still don't have proper access to mental health care, no matter how many ministerial roundtables on mental health and addictions I've sat at and made recommendations to. The progress is slow. And so, you have to recognize that people who are not affected by anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenousness and Islamophobia and homophobia and transphobia, they are not going to have the same kind of rigor and vigor as people who live it and who experience it. And so we have to expect that you have to take into account that there's going to be interest and then there's going to be disinterest, but that does not stop us from moving. That does not stop us from doing the work. That does not stop us from leveraging our networks and leveraging our expertise and our connections towards making change. We have to keep people engaged and we have to keep talking about it. So I'm talking about anti-Black racism now as much as I was talking about it in 2020, because I know that it's intrinsic to to my work and also to the ways that people move through healthcare systems. Just because it's not as trendy as it was 2 years ago doesn't mean that it's not still happening, right? So, make your own wave, right? Be consistent with it, and recognize that people are going to get fatigued, but, you don't get fatigued, right? You keep being measured and being pragmatic in your steps and in your approach, and you keep pushing and pushing for that incremental change that you can make in your organization or in your field, right? But people are going to be fatigued, because living through racism is tiring, and if you're not the recipient of racism, right? And people who are not the recipient, who are not used to the fight, they're going to get tired quicker, right? Or their allyship is going to be contingent upon their interests. We have to expect this, anticipate this, but keep organizing for our movements, whether or not people are interested in us. And in terms of like people within the movement being fatigued, allowing ourselves to take those breaks and mentoring and ensuring that there's someone else that can come up behind us and do the work and take on the mantle if we have to take a break, right? So there's two different kinds of fatigues, I think. The fatigue of living through it and having to deal with it, but then this fatigue that people have, oh, we're still talking about, Black people and anti-Black racism. Yeah, we're going to keep talking about it until it stops, until all these systems are dismantled. So, it's a tough place to be in, but we have to anticipate it and plan for it and plan around it.
But you talk about the fatigue and the burnout, but the question beckons, can we really dismantle these systems, or are we just sort of going to the win and capitalism is here to stay and capitalism is here to rule? Can we really reinvigorate or retool capitalism in a way to make it sort of equitable?
No, I don't think that we can retool or reinvigorate capitalism. I do think that we need a total transformation of the system. And is that possible? Maybe not in my lifetime, maybe not in yours, but I think that the earth, through climate change and all of these things that we're saying, I think it's showing us like the earth is actually it's insistent upon this change. We have to do something drastic and dramatic and also incremental, because the very place that we live, that we thrive, that we work in, that we exist in, it is rejecting fully the way that we are engaging with the land, right? So it's good. I don't think that capitalism can be rejigged or retooled or made feminist or
Mm-hmm.
made pro-Black. I don't think that it's possible, because
Mm-hmm.
if it was, I think we would have tried to do it by now. I think that, or somebody could have proposed it, maybe we could see something, but I see us just basically, if we're going to keep the system, living in it and making ourselves as comfortable as possible, knowing that there are people who are going to be made very uncomfortable rather, or we are going to work towards something brand new. And I'm of the latter school of thought. I think we need something brand new.
So there are two questions that I want to point you, because being in the university setting, sort of about the role of research here. But there are two questions coming from the chats here that I'll sort of put them together. And the first one is, how do we address the anger we may feel when we have to deal with a system of indifference?
Mm.
And the second one is, what would you say is the role of research and researchers in dismantling racial capitalism? So let's first talk about sort of how you deal with this anger of indifference, and then sort of, is there a role for research, or to what extent does research really matter, particularly given what you're saying, that the earth may just sort of force us to change as opposed to us thinking about change? I mean, what more can be said, or what more can be done from a research perspective that might change the hearts and minds of the people who actually need to be convinced that there is a problem with the system?
Okay, so I'm going to address the first piece about the anger. And I think anger, like hope, like happiness, these are natural emotions. And I think I think it's healthy to address the anger that we might be feeling with this system of indifference. I don't think that we should ignore it, minimize it, overlook it. We should confront the anger that we feel, because it's a human emotion, and it can be a healthy emotion depending on how you channel your anger, right? Or you channel your dislike of the existing system. So I think address it, be one with the feeling, acknowledge that this is how you feel and that you're warranted in your anger, because it's maddening, it's ridiculous how things are, right? So I would say that I would respond that to that question. And then the second question, can you repeat it for me, please, Tavis?
What role does research, what role would you say that research and researchers play in dismantling racial capitalism?
Well, I mean, racial capitalism is really central to my work because it allows me to make connections to between existing contemporary, oppressions and discriminations and historical systems of oppression and discrimination, such as specifically slavery and colonialism, right? So as a researcher, the work that I do is rooted in that historical, radical tradition, Black thought, Black radical tradition that speaks to that really speaks to the need for methods of research that are grounded in community. So, I think that it really depends on what kind of research you're trying to do. Are you an armchair researcher where you're sending out a bunch of researchers into the field and they come back and you're disconnected from the community? Or are you doing real community-based participatory research where you're working with communities, you're working amongst communities, you're employing people from the communities? That's the type of research that I like to do. The Pathways to Care project that I've been working on since 2018, it is the largest community-based participatory research project that I've done. And we have employed so many people from the community, whether that's been to be community liaisons, to conduct parts of our focus groups and our interviews, to do transcriptions at every single level. We have a youth advisory committee that's our governance structure that's made up of Black youth from communities across, mostly from Toronto, but also from across the province. That's, it feels amazing to be rooted in community in that way and to be doing research. And it gave a different contour to my research experience because I was not just beholden to the organization and to ethics, I was beholden to these people, right? We did community member checkings after each focus group that we did so that we could ensure that your narratives were captured correctly and were accurate to what your messages were, right? So I think that, research, depending on how it's done, and especially if it's rooted in community, it can be incredibly useful and intrinsic and important to the work of undoing racial capitalism, but you have to be intentional about it.
So another audience question is, some researchers argue that health disparities, especially in large cities such as Chicago, are caused by structural violence that concentrates poverty in certain neighborhoods while allowing others to flourish. How do such arguments overlap or contrast with your approach to health disparities? So sort of the intersection between sort of violence and health disparities are things we can think about, learn, are there similarities, are there differences, etc.
I mean, this is very absolutely true. Those arguments absolutely overlap with my approach to health research and addressing health disparities. Toronto is a large city. When we were seeing COVID-19, I was teaching at the time and I told my students, let's look at this map where COVID-19 is exploding, where there is, high rates of contracting COVID-19 and dying from COVID-19. And let's layer it atop the census data. Who's living in those neighborhoods? Well, mostly Black, mostly immigrant, mostly racialized communities in the northern, we call it the northern corridor of our city. And then I took a map that we developed at Pathways to Care that also showed so we developed this map that basically allows people to find mental health care services nearby them across 6 cities in the province, and Toronto is one of them. And what we saw immediately on the map was that in some communities, there were very sparse mental health services, while downtown Toronto had all of the mental health care services. So when we layered that map atop the COVID-19 map that came out from the city of Toronto, it was the exact same communities that were experiencing the same kinds of mental health disparities and disparities with regard to COVID-19. And these are very segregated communities. Again, it's racialized communities, mainly Black communities, low income communities, immigrant communities. And so, we can't ignore, that's the data screaming at you, right? We're a segregated city. People in Toronto, in Canada, we pride ourselves, we're multicultural and it's a part of our, it's actually part of our laws and, this, that, and the other. Okay, but people in the northern corridor of our city who are mostly Black and brown and poor did not have access to COVID-19 testing, did not have access to COVID-19 vaccinations, do not have access to mental health care. So what are we doing about that, right? So I believe, structural violence is an absolutely real thing, and it's a very useful framework to address these inequities and address health disparities and to work towards that structural change. The answer is that we need to, I don't want to say pump, but we need to ensure that these communities are furnished with the same kinds, if not more, so we need an equitable lens, more resources than our downtown communities, right? Because there's more need there. If there's more disease and death and illness there, then there's going to be more need there. So structural violence and segregation can lend to structural change, right? Where we can use these maps and this research and this information to say, like, well, why don't we have more mental health care services in the northern part of Toronto or in certain parts of Chicago? I'm sorry, I don't know the neighborhoods in Chicago, but why don't we have access to more healthcare and more better education in these places if we see that they are disenfranchised?
So Sharon has a really interesting question. It goes back to the chicken and the egg dilemma that you first started off, the provocative thought of this idea of, which came first, racism or capitalism? And I hope I'm saying she correctly here, is asking, with that in mind, and is wondering, is there any value to focusing on one aspect over the other for the sake of anticipating and strategizing against backlash? So if we were to think about the interrelationship between capitalism and racism, do we need to focus on them collectively, the way that I understand this question, together, or do we need to focus on one or the other? And again, this comes back to this idea of, do we accept the system that we're in? Do we need to change the system? Do we need to fix the system? And so, or is it beyond a systematic level of thinking and we need to do something else, perhaps really think outside the box when we think about the relationship between the two?
Wow, I like your question, Shannon. This is very thought-provoking and definitely making me use my on my feet response skills. I mean, I don't think that I could have sit here after saying, like, we need to dismantle capitalism and we need to, ensure that these movements are also anti-racist. I don't think that we should be focusing on one without the other, because if we focus on one without the other, you're inevitably going to come up against someone saying, like, well, this isn't anti-capitalist enough, or I'm experiencing, anti-Black racism or racism in these spaces that are organized on capitalism. I think that they have to go hand in hand. We have to do a little bit of heavy lifting, and we have to commit. That's why I think the term racial capitalism is actually so useful for us, because it's not, if we go back to Cedric Johnson's definition and his use of the term, we don't need to privilege one over the other. We actually have to look at them together, and we have to be creating movements and work and opportunities and research that anticipates the coexistence of these phenomena, right? So the answer really is in the concept itself. We can't do one without the other. Because as much as you anticipate and strategize, believe me, you're going to come up short if you're only focusing on one or focusing on one aspect more than the other. It has to be a simultaneous effort, because that's how racial capitalism is simultaneous. It's a mutually beneficial, these two mutually beneficial systems interlocking and working with and strengthening one another.
So it seems to me like sort of an elephant in the room that we're not talking about, but sort of sitting there is sort of race, like just race in general. So we talk about racial capitalism and the link between race and capitalism, but let's sort of spend a little bit of time and just sort of conceptualizing sort of race and what does that mean, and also what then becomes our ways of acting and being, because one of the things about, again, being at the Jesuit institution is that, we encourage our students to go forth and set the world ablaze on fire, in a good way, that is. But the question then becomes, are there things that perhaps people of color or BIPOC people need to do that are different from, let's say, white people need to do And particularly here, I'm thinking about the way in which the white supremacist structures continue to operationalize the way that we think are and the way that we learn. So even if you think of the educational structures, this structure that we're in right now is built upon white supremacists, and we've all learned in a sort of a very sort of Western way of being, in a Western way of thinking because of Western modernity. And we're not sticking to our ancestral traditions, but we've sort of acclimatized ourselves to a sort of a white supremacist academic structure. So when you sort of think about racism, are there things that is this a collective job that we need to do that racial capitalism is telling us, or do we first need to perhaps do individual work, BIPOC doing their own work, whites doing their own work, or sort of how do you come down on that?
That's a really good question, Tavis. And it reminds me of something that I heard maybe a couple of days ago or weeks ago, can't remember. But there was somebody who was saying that when they do workshops about anti-Black racism, they don't want Black people in the room because it can be triggering. Because this is not a theoretical exercise, this is lived experience, right? And that those spaces can be even violent for people who have to firstly relive anti-Blackness or experiences of anti-Blackness, or might have to feel like they have to be a spokesperson for the Black experience, right? It's between the trainer and people who engage in anti-Blackness. And that's not to say that Black communities cannot join or participate in anti-Blackness, but it's in different ways, right? It's very different, and it's not systemic and ingrained into our societies in the same way. And so for that reason, it is incumbent upon people who are non-Black to be relentless in their work around anti-racism and anti-Black racism. It can't be a moment, it can't be a hashtag, it can't be, a paper or a project or a research idea. It actually has to be your commitment, right? And that has to be reflected throughout all parts of your life and your mission. So there is different, we don't start at the same, starting points, right? My lived experience with anti-Blackness and Islamophobia and anti-Black Islamophobia is very different from even other Muslims who are not Black and their experience of Islamophobia, right? So they have to engage, Muslims who are in my community have to engage in the work of anti-Black, undoing anti-Blackness and in understanding how they contribute to anti-Blackness and understanding how anti-Black Islamophobia negatively impacts people who are Black and who are perceived to be Muslims, right? Or whether they're Muslim or not. So I think that, expecting that we all have the same job is pretty ridiculous because we don't all have the same experience. So from that perspective, we all have different work to do and we have different commitments to the work. And to be quite honest, people who are non-Black have to have an even larger commitment to the work because of the ways that people who are not Black or who are, beneficiaries of white privilege and white supremacist structures benefit from the existing system, right? You don't even have to do much to benefit from that system if you're, if the system is built to empower you and to benefit you. So then your work is actually even more important because you have to unlearn all that and be critical of the system and of your own inherent privilege, and then work towards rectifying it in your own specific way and in your environment, whether that's with your community or your family or with your loved ones and partners and spouses, etc. So we don't all have the same experience, so we don't have the same expectations.
A lot of research talks about the invisible labor that Black people sort of put in, particularly in the academy. Also, a lot of other research also talks about the invisible labor that women put in, regardless of race, sort of in there. And so one of the questions from the chat is that some scholars of racial capitalism, like Jennifer Morgan, place the reproductive labor of women at the very center of their analysis. In a post-Roe v. Wade America, what is the relevance of reproductive labor of women in the analysis of racial capitalism?
Okay, now we're getting deep. Now we're getting deep into this conversation. What a great question. Okay, so obviously I'm in Canada. We don't have Roe v. Wade, which doesn't make it a perfect situation that we have. It's in some provinces it's very difficult to get an abortion, and reproductive rights are under fire all the time for women all over the world. We know whether or not it's legalized or not. So I mean, I think that reproductive labor, I think I opened up by talking about how there's a gendered element. I think that racial capitalism in its original kind of form does not always address. And that's why I really like, we have to think about like supplementary ways to understand this phenomena. So like Angela Davis, for example, her work on women, race, and class is like a really good opportunity for us to explore racial capitalism, but also the gendered element of it, because we know that there's a gender wage gap that exists all around the world. It's, you know, it's a fact, it's not a theory. And we also know that worldwide, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, nobody is paid for being a stay-at-home mother, parent, right? And so reproductive labor is absolutely fundamental. It should be fundamental to our analysis of racial capitalism. And it's incumbent on us to understand how, even within that concept, groups might be left out, right? So, you know, in short, the access to abortion, access to good reproductive health, and reproductive health rights, ensuring that women have, you know, the access that they need to healthcare systems that are culturally and responsive and also specific to their needs. It's intrinsic, right? It's intrinsic to that recipe that we're, you know, cooking around racial capitalism. We have to think about the disproportionate ways that women are marginalized and exploited in our capitalist system, and also the ways that racism, you know, specifically has impacts on Black women, women of color, right? Who gets to be at the forefront of racial movements? Why is the Black radical tradition, which I got my foundational understanding of racial capitalism in, and the Caribbean radical tradition, why is that mainly Black men? Why is that, right? Why were those voices the ones that were most pronounced, right? For better or for worse, we have some amazing information and amazing books and theory and context that have been built from it. But you know, I've always asked, like when I was doing Caribbean studies, like why aren't there more Caribbean women who are in this area? Why aren't we hearing more about queer people, right? You know, we have Stuart Hall, but you know, why don't we know more about other people who didn't fit the ideal mold of you know, these anti-colonial, anti-capitalist leaderships in this field, right? Why were women left out? So we have to think about this. We have to think about the erasure of women, and the lack of access to reproductive rights, and you know, equal pay, and all of the things that women have been struggling for.
One of the things I wanted to turn our attention to is, since the election of Barack Obama in the US, we often talk about this sort of post-racial society. How then do we reconcile issues around post-racialism if we are indeed in a post-racial society? Because many question that maybe we somewhat aren't in this post-racial society. How do we then reconcile that with what I might call the virtues, if I may, of racial capitalism? You know, what then can we, or how then can we think of what lessons might a post-racial American society be able to not learn but to place on racial capitalism?
Well, I mean, I don't think America is a post-racial society. I don't think Canada is a post-racial society. I don't think anywhere, even Black countries, Black majority countries, I don't think that these are post-racial societies, because I have a problem with the idea of post-racial. Like, what does that mean? We're after race? Like, it's such a strange concept to me, because race and racism is fundamental to the workings of our societies, right? So to be post-racial indicates that we have somehow, you know, gone beyond these structures that essentially structure our worlds, right? So I don't think that we're post-racial at all. I don't think that Barack Obama's election, or the new guy in the UK,
In the
I
UK,
can't
yes,
remember his name,
yes.
forgive me, I don't think that that indicates a post-racialism. I don't think that, you know, we had an election last night in Toronto and we see more Black people. It was a municipal election. We've seen more progressives elected, and the first hijab wearing Toronto district councillor ever. That doesn't mean that we're post-Islamophobic. it's going to actually get pretty scary, I'm sure, for people who are Black and who are hijab wearing and Muslims who are now in these leadership roles here in the city, right? So I fundamentally don't accept that idea because it assumes that we have somehow dismantled our structures through symbolic leadership. I don't think that's real at all.
No, I right there with you. I'm going to start pivot as we start winding down here. So if there are any sort of final audience questions, now would be the time to put it into the chat as we begin to wind down here. And I just have a couple more questions for you, Fatima. The first one is, and this may be a big thing or a small thing, but in light of where I am, where I think I ought to be, maybe I'm woke, maybe I'm not, how do I disinvest from capitalism?
Okay, this is a really good question. And I was at this conference not a few weeks ago, it was actually last week. And there was a session on climate justice and, how it relates to activism in the Caribbean, whether that's gender activism, LGBTQ activism, trans activism, et cetera. And, the person who's leading that session went around the room and essentially asked how people are, divesting from capitalism and working against the climate crisis. And, I remember looking to the person beside me and saying, I get nervous when this topic comes up because I hear people's ideas and I hear what they're doing, but I get so overwhelmed when I think about the climate change and the way the earth is actively, rejecting the way that we're engaging with it. But and the person says, I feel you, but there's some good ideas out here. And so I heard all these amazing acts that were both working towards climate justice, but also working towards divesting from capitalism. So, individual acts like conscious consumption, especially of plastics and clothing. We can all, consciously consume and decide how much plastic we're going to use, per week or per day, or are we going to use, reusable containers? Do we really need to buy a brand new winter coat this winter if our previous one fits or not? Which is another, question, right? Post or ongoing in COVID, right? Do we need that? Can we just get it altered? That's something that we can actively divest from capitalism by saying, like, what do I already have and how can I reuse it? How can I make it better? How can I make it fit? But also one thing that got to me in that discussion was small farming. So a lot of these people are from the Caribbean. So if you're in Grenada, you definitely are, you might have more access to some land and opportunity to grow more things and better weather to grow things year round. But I started thinking, hey, this summer I grew a small garden on my balcony and I grew just 4 things. Not all of them turned out well and raccoons ended up eating up most of it. But, I felt really good being able to know, I don't have to buy tomatoes or green peppers, or I don't need to buy flowers for my home because I'm growing them on my balcony, and seeing bees come into my space. It was it was almost spiritual. I would sit out there all the time and think, this is amazing. But I was doing it as a way to, do something fun over the summer. But in that session, I started to realize, hey, this is one way that I kind of divested from capitalism. I had to buy all the seeds, but I was still able to grow my own small food and share some of that with people. But at the same time, I think when we're talking about divesting from capitalism and the issues of climate change, and we can't ignore those larger systemic issues that exist, and the fact that we can do a lot on our end, but big businesses also need to be held accountable for the way they are mistreating and abusing the planet in the name of capitalism and profit. So there's a direct link, right? We have a responsibility to the earth to protest those big businesses and to demand that they transform and change the way that they're doing business, because this directly negatively affects poor, racialized Black and Brown people, LGBTQ people, women, children, et cetera. It negatively impacts those amongst us who are the most been made most marginal. So I think that's one way that we can divest from capitalism. Another way that we can divest from capitalism, I think, is in recognizing that the death and displacement of Indigenous people and the enslavement of Black people are the foundations of North America, and that those are directly tied to to capitalism. So if we're, critiquing, capitalism, we also have to be critiquing these world systems that are our very countries, America and Canada, and even the Caribbean, that they've been founded on, right? We have to recognize that in order to start divesting from it.
No, that is really really interesting, and I like your thoughts and your thinking here. And this sort of builds on a question that Saeed has, and he's asking, when we talk about racism, you have rightfully mentioned that it's inherently wrong, and we have a clear normative framework to counter it. But when we talk about capitalism, what alternative are we talking about? Is it more of a welfare model, throwing something to all together, something in between? What should we strive for then? So, you understand it. So, we sort of understand the racial components, but for capitalism, then what should we strive for? Recognizing that we are at 9+ billion right now and counting. And what does that mean? We're consuming approximately 6 Earths right now. What does that mean? Can we continue to grow? And last night I saw an interesting video that said that Africa is now the fastest growing climate in terms of population, while Europe is declining. Can we really sustain that? And from a racial capitalist perspective, what sort of economic model should we be thinking about? Should we be striving to make sure that we're all getting at least a minimum decent living? I see it decent, or let me phrase that, having at least a decent livelihood.
It's a really good question, Tavis. And this is one that I think about all the time. I think I started when I was in university, undergrad. I was reading a lot of socialist literature, and I was really interested in Cuba and all of these socialist contexts where the state is essentially everything goes back to the state. And I thought, this doesn't sit that well with me, right? Because it was often presented as the alternative model to capitalism. And I knew capitalism didn't sit well with me either. And I mean, the welfare model doesn't answer every issue as well, or every concern that I have as well. And I am of the belief that we need to start from scratch, but we don't have to start without knowledge, right? We can ascertain what components have worked and if that can work moving forward. But I am of the opinion that we should be transforming our systems into something brand new. I don't think that reverting to any one system, it hasn't worked, right? There's no perfect context, and maybe even a new system might not work. But I do think that, what do we have to lose at this point? Our Earth is literally telling us it has had enough. What do we have to lose if we engage in transformation of our systems? We have nothing to lose and maybe a lot to gain. So I don't have the answer, unfortunately, Syed. I wish I did. If I had the answer, believe me, this would be a completely different webinar. I would be coming with a point-by-point plan, but I don't have the answer. I just know that what is working so far cannot work, and that what we can work towards can be better reflective of the place that we're in and our realities as individuals and communities. And that's what I'm hopeful for. And that's what that's the message that I like to leave people with. The same thing when I proposed this at the conference that I went to in Barbados, people were like, well, what's the system? I was like, well, I have no idea. I can't do everything, but we can talk about it. We can, we can use all of our amazing brain power and all the knowledge that we have. We're perhaps some of the most, we're at the most advanced when it comes to sharing knowledge, right? And strategies and being able to look at historically what has worked and what hasn't worked. We can do this. We can do this if we want to. If we don't want to, then we're going to just continue doing what we've been doing, and it's an inevitable downhill struggle that we're going to be engaging in.
I constantly tell my students that I have messed the world up and it's for them to clean it up. And I think that's what you're saying, is that, Saeed and his generation needs to come up with an alternative model that they're comfortable with to get them and their children and their children's children's through.
But it's up to us also, Tavis. We also have to do some work too. So yeah, we definitely messed it up, and our parents also really messed it up, and their
That is
parents
true.
probably as well. So, while we're all here, we all have a responsibility to each other. But yeah, like I think it is. I don't know how outside it is. I'm assuming that they're like an undergrad, but yeah, it is a part of the work that that they have to do and that we have to do, and whoever else is left here that we all have to engage in, right? It's all of our responsibilities for as long as we're going to be here, and even beyond for how long we're going to be here. We have to leave something for people to inherit. Right now, we're leaving absolutely nothing.
So we've been talking for about 70 minutes now, and it's been great, but we've got to start wrapping up. And so my wrap-up question, there are a couple of things I'm going to sort of throw at you in terms of wrap-up question, and maybe take one last audience question is, for those of us who are new to racial capitalism, so for some people, this is the first time maybe they're actually hearing it, sort of, what resources would you recommend that they consult? Who should they be reading? Where can they get a deeper understanding of it, particularly as racial capitalism is now a very interdisciplinary concept? And the other question is sort of, where should we go from here? What next?
So I would definitely suggest Cedric Johnson's book on racial capitalism, which is called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Beautiful book, written in the 80s. So some of us might have been born at the time that the book came out, but it's still applicable, and it's still very, on point. And I mentioned some of these authors and some of these books as being fundamental to and foundational to my training and knowledge and engagement with the Black radical and Caribbean radical tradition. A lot of these books are by Caribbean descendant people, but they really formed my understanding of anti-capitalist traditions and Black radical traditions. So, I've mentioned Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class to give that gender element, which is incredibly important, and I think sometimes maybe missing from the racial capitalism concept. C.L.R. James, a beautiful writer, Trinidadian, wrote a book called The Black Jacobins, which is all about a lot about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, which is, was fundamentally about anti-colonial, anti-slavery movement, and also address these issues that we're talking about today around race and class. Walter Rodney, Guyanese Tavis, to me the greatest Guyanese I think that ever walked this earth. I love Walter Rodney. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, seminal texts that people I think can engage with and should be engaging with. Frantz Fanon, I'm sure many people in the room, are aware of his work. Some people may or may not know he's also a Caribbean person, originally from Martinique. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, can't tell you how many times I've returned to that text over my life. And Frantz Fanon is really an author because of his work also in mental health, psychiatry, psychotherapy. He's in every single one of my theses. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, is a beautiful book to read. And then there's actually a writer who's based here in Canada. Her name is Robin Maynard. She wrote a book called Policing Black Lives. It's not explicitly about racial capitalism, but it does talk a lot about racism, policing, builds that trajectory of understanding, between coloniality in Canada and current ways that Black people are policed and surveilled, and the issues around race and racism. There's some anti-capitalist undercurrents there that I really like. And then Tavis, I know that you had mentioned it, the book by Destin Jenkins and Justin Leroy that came out last year, The Histories of Racial Capitalism. I haven't gotten a chance to read that yet, but it's on my long list of texts that I want to be reading.
Yeah, and then the sort of the second part of my question in about a minute or so, where do we go from here, or what should we do from here?
I think that what we need to do from here is examine our placement in the world, whether we benefit from white supremacy and white privilege, or whether we benefit from any kind of privilege. Be clear about that, and then be clear about what you are willing to do to work against the effects and the systems of racism and capitalism and racial capitalism. So there's some introspective work, some individual level work that needs to be done, but we can't stop there. That needs to then be fed out towards collective work. So that means being active, whether that's at a professional level or as an extracurricular or service level. We have to translate the introspection, the individual level change towards some sort of collective change. Get together with people who mirror your beliefs, who can challenge you. Come to events like this. I was so pleased to see 50-something people in this room to hear about racial capitalism, and I'm pleased that this is one of several different webinars, right, that are going to be looking at racial capitalism from multiple perspectives. And there's something in there, I think, for everybody to hold on to. So if you're interested in health, in health disparities, how can you start infusing that analysis into your work? How can you start infusing that into your everyday life? If you're, if you want to be an advocate for around mental health, how can you ensure that you're being aware of the impacts of racial capitalism and all the other ways that it impacts our life, whether that's through food, whether that's through education, how are we going to be active members of our societies and of our communities to be working against this? So I would say do the internal work and the individual work, and then find people who you can group up with and seek to make some sort of incremental and measurable change.
So I'm going to do this to you in 1 minute. I need you to answer this last question.
Okay.
How can we train doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, including researchers and academics, to ensure that they're equipped with the knowledge and skills to move towards achieving health equity across races, class, religion, and gender? So sort of what does that training look like? If you can tell me that in 1 minute.
Curriculum transformation. When I was in Barbados, we were doing classes with, training doctors or doctors in training to sensitize them towards LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ needs in healthcare settings. It became part of the curriculum. It has to become systematized. Everyone has to undergo that training, and people who are living the experience need to be centered in that training and in that curriculum as well.
Perfect. Alison, can you please put up the slide for me? So I just want to remind people that this is, as I said, this was the first of many more conversations that we'll be having on racial capitalism. I invite you to click on the QRC code, and on November 8th at this time, at approximately at 11, we'll be having another conversation on racial capitalism and food insecurity in the United States. So we invite you to join us there. You should be seeing our flyers going around. We also have a short survey that we ask if you take a minute just to fill it in. It should take you approximately a minute. Alison will drop it into the chat for us if you can do that. And then we also invite you to stay connected with the Institute for Racial Justice, and we invite you to continue to join many of the programmings that we have for you over the course of the next academic year. Did I capture everything? I think I got everything. So the link should be in the chat coming for you to fill in. These are the ways that you can stay connected to the Institute of Racial Justice. I would like to thank the law school and the Institute of Racial Justice for putting this webinar on as the first, as I said. Join us on November 8th again. And my Fatimah, Dr. Jackson-Best, thank you so much for an invigorating conversation for the last 75 minutes that certainly has gotten us to think and pulsating, and I feel shivers on my skin. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Tavis. Thanks for your wonderful questions. And thank you everybody in the audience for your participation, questions, engagement. I appreciate it. Thank you, Loyola, and all the organizers as well.
Thanks again, audience members. Thank you for your great question. Fill the survey in, and we look forward to seeing you on November 8th at our next session.